All right, kids, the phrase one bad apple gets thrown around a lot these days. It's most often applied to a police officer who has done something wrong and is possibly in trouble. Versions of this proverb can be found as far back as the early 16th century. Its usage allows people to acknowledge that officers are not representative of the police departments as a whole, and that an individual's rotten behavior can be isolated from the system. You know, the whole bunch. More on that later, but as we'll talk about today, evidently, these bad apples come from a tree in our own backyard. On Tuesday, December 22nd, Columbus police officer Adam Coy murdered Andre Hill, a 47-year-old black man who was an expected guest at a friend's home. He was unarmed and not attacking. Officer Adam Coy pulled the trigger multiple times on his service weapon just 10 seconds after he encountered Andre Hill in the garage at that home. Hill was holding his phone in his left hand and his right hand was in his pocket at the time of his death. We know all of this because Officer Adam Coy was wearing a body cam at the time of the murder. It wasn't turned on prior to the deadly interaction with Andre Hill, but Officer Coy turned it on afterward, which lets you know that he either wasn't trained well or didn't anticipate danger. Thanks to a 60-second look back feature, the body camera records everything that occurred 1 minute prior to it being turned on, but without audio. Also, the patrol car dash cam didn't record the incident. It cuts on automatically when an officer uses the siren and cuts on the flashing lights. But Officer Coy didn't need to do that because it wasn't an emergency call. A noise complaint is what he was responding to, which further lets you know that this was not a perceived dangerous situation that warranted deadly force. Apparently, someone called about a parked SUV that had been running on and off for a period of time. To me, the person inside that car was exercising self-care. Kids, your parents, and a lot of adults sit in the car for an unknown amount of time in order to gather themselves after arriving home. Sometimes it's to finish a song, other times it's to finish eating a snack we don't want to share. All the time, it's necessary. So we can all agree, Officer Adam Coy, one bad apple, right? Wrong. Officer Coy was one of 2 officers who responded to the non-emergency disturbance call. There was a female officer who has yet to be named. Also, 5.5 minutes goes by after Andre Hill was shot before anyone administers first aid to him, let alone assures him that help is on the way. Instead, other police officers are seen putting up caution tape and not attending to the victim. During a press conference, attorney Ben Crump said that the officers were coordinating their stories at the scene after the shooting and killing of Andre Hill. Additionally, a family member says in an unedited video they saw, Officer Coy can be heard saying, "I need to figure out what I'm going to say," after the shooting, with one officer telling Coy, "I got you." Keep in mind, all of this occurred a little more than 2 weeks, a fortnight, after Casey Goodson Jr. was murdered by Franklin County Sheriff's Office Deputy Jason Meade. The eyes of the state and this country were already on local law enforcement in Columbus, and we're down bad. Jason Meade, one bad apple. Well, it's come out that he's also a pastor. Here's an excerpt from one of his sermons about David and Goliath back in 2018. "I learned long ago why I'm justified in throwing the first punch. Don't look up here like, oh, police brutality," he said racistly. He would go on to say, "People I hit, you wish you could hit. Trust me, right?" He laughs and says, "Yeah, every time I hit him, I'm like, that's for you and that's for you," referring to the audience. Other sheriff's office deputies were present, and I wonder if any of them considered what Jason Meade said was at least weird. He lives in Ohio. In 2018, a perfect David versus Goliath analogy would have been about the Browns. Only the Cleveland Browns would have been David without a slingshot and would just lose. No story there, no inspiration. When Casey Goodson Jr. was murdered on December 4th, was this Meade preemptively hitting him? Similarly, U.S. Marshal Peter Tobin declared Casey Goodson Jr.'s killing justified before the investigation. A gun was reportedly recovered at the scene of the crime, but where? How? On December 16th, Columbus police said Meade was interviewed earlier that week, but that was not the case. FBI is currently investigating. We're giving only half truth or partial truth, which is not truth. Earlier, I mentioned that the phrase one bad apple dates back to the 1500s. I find it interesting that it is most often attributed to rotten police officers because one bad apple is only half stated. The whole thing goes, one bad apple spoils the bunch. That's what we're seeing from law enforcement. So what one bad apple spoils the whole bunch really means is a bad apple is someone who creates problems or causes trouble for others, specifically a member of a group whose behavior reflects poorly on or negatively affects or influences the remainder of the group. It may be convenient for me to call Officer Coy a bad apple now, after he murdered an unarmed black man who was not attacking, but he has been in trouble before, so the seeds of his badness had been growing. For instance, in 2012, he was given a 160-hour suspension after banging the head of a driver he stopped for drunk driving against the hood of a car. The driver was also paid $45,000 as part of a settlement. Officer Coy's personal file also includes 90 civilian complaints, the most recent of which was dated in 2012. With cops like Officer Coy getting slaps on the wrist and maintaining their jobs, what we're really missing from the whole bunch is a lack of discipline, accountability, and justice. With that being said, it is not uncommon for the Columbus Police Department to maintain a police officer who has killed someone. In 2016, Zachary Rosen was one of two plainclothes officers who shot and killed Henry Green. He wasn't disciplined or indicted by a federal grand jury. A year later, Zachary Rosen was fired for using unreasonable force when he kicked an unarmed restrained suspect in the head. The Fraternal Order of Police pretty much made the city of Columbus rehire him in 2018. Up until that point, including Zachary Rosen, Columbus police had fired just 14 officers that decade, and 3 were rehired after appeals from the FOP. Officer Coy, Sheriff's Deputy Meade, and Officer Rosen are bad apples that are either spoiling the whole bunch or the whole bunch has spoiled these individuals, and the barrel holding them all together is our silence. No, not all cops are bad, but if one bad cop kills someone and the officer doesn't call that person out, they're complicit. So what makes them good apples? 2 weeks ago, when I made the video about Casey Goodson Jr. being murdered, I had no intentions, let alone anticipation, of that video being a part 1. And now I'm here talking about Andre Hill being the victim of police brutality in our own backyard. He was 47 years old. I want to revisit the message from that first video. When you see something, say something. Despite all this, people, companies, and organizations are still reluctant to call out the police and law enforcement. Accountability doesn't hurt good officers. Silence helps bad ones. Focusing on one officer ain't it. We're calling out the whole force because the whole force isn't calling out one officer. Because of how bad the Jason Meade and Casey Goodson Jr. case has been handled, I'm grateful that a body camera was worn and turned on, albeit late. And I'm thankful that the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation is involved, and I'm glad that Mayor Ginther is calling for Adam Coy's firing. All of these things should be the bare minimum. He should be talking about his arrest. All of this really feels like more than just bad apples that came from our own backyard. Attorneys, the police chief, protocol procedures, policies, the FOP, and the mayor may just be the root of it. My silence won't be a part of it, and I don't want to make a part 3. So we're going to be all right. I'm your president. I'll give you a hand. Haircut, that's black.